both?
Yes, we can. And we can
Thank
see
you.
you. It's perfect.
Great. So good morning and good afternoon. Greetings of the new year and welcome to the very first session of the second research conference on forced displacement, organized by the World Bank and UNHCR's Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, School of Economics of the Universidad de los Andes and the Development Research Group of the World Bank. Very quickly, my name is Abul Azad. I'm a senior economist with the JDC and will be your facilitator for this session. In this session, we will have presentations on 4 research papers with a key focus on cash transfer programs for refugees in refugee host countries. Mirko Winter from the University of Oxford, Bart Osler from the World Bank, Anwar Altindak from the University of Bentley, and Murat Kirdar from Boğaziçi University will be presenting the papers. To all the presenters, please note that you will have 20 to 25 minutes each to present your paper, and there will be 5 to 10 minutes for question and answer after each presentation. I'll be your timekeeper. We'll give you reminders at 15 and 20 minutes. So without further delay, I would like to welcome everyone to the very first paper, Food Aid and Refugee Coping Strategies. Evidence from a Regression Discontinuing Design. It is authored by Mirko Winter and Olivia Stark of the University of Oxford. The paper focuses on the effects of a reduction in food entitlements in a large refugee camp in Uganda on key health, nutritional, and employment outcomes. Mirko, on behalf of his team, will be presenting. Mirko, apologies if I have changed the meaning of your name by completely mispronouncing your name. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and let's get going right away. I hope you can see the presentation, and thank you so much for the introduction. We have added one additional co-author in the meantime, and Iman has done incredible work on this paper. It's a great honor for all of us to present the paper and to kickstart the event with our research. As we've heard in the introduction, refugee numbers have been increasing over the last couple of years, and there are now 26 million refugees globally who were forced to leave their home countries and settle in other countries to find refuge. As we've heard from Mary and Bjorn, many of these individuals are living in other countries for several years in protracted situations, which very often makes them reliant on the service and aid delivery from the international community, most notably the UNHCR and the World Food Programme. However, as refugee numbers increase, so does the demand for services, and the UNHCR and the World Food Programme are often faced with funding shortages because of the increased demand. This leads them to reduce their aid to certain individuals in order to be able to serve everyone who is in need. Very often, refugees who have lived in a country for several years are the ones to see their aid withdrawn first, because they have been living in the country for a couple of years and are therefore deemed to have become more self-reliant. In our paper, we're investigating in how far this is true, and how far individuals indeed have become more self-reliant over time, and when faced with a very large shock in terms of their food rations, whether they are able to cope with such shock and in which ways they do so. So far, there exists very little empirical evidence on these questions because there's a lack of exogenous variation. We cannot just run an experiment and see whether aid reductions have changed the employment, health, or other outcomes for refugees because of obvious moral reasons. In our case, we explored a very unique regression discontinuity in Uganda, which allows us to say something about these questions. In 2015, the WFP Uganda was forced to reduce their aid entitlements to around 50% of their aid beneficiaries, and they did so by setting a particular cutoff. They set a cutoff to 2013, and all refugees who arrived before this date saw their ration entitlements reduced by 50%. All refugees who arrived after this date remained eligible for the full ration. We will exploit this regression discontinuity to see what the impact was in terms of employment, health, and other outcomes. But before that, a little bit of information on the setting. We, as has been said, are looking at Nakivale refugee settlement, which is one of Uganda's largest refugee settlements, and it houses around 105,000 refugees. It's located in a remote yet fertile area in southern Uganda, which allows for agriculture. Differently to perhaps other countries in Africa, Uganda has a very progressive refugee framework. It doesn't follow an encampment model, where rights are very often limited and economic opportunities as well. but rather refugees arriving in Uganda are given the right to access employment. They can also establish businesses. They have freedom of movement and are integrated in the local service delivery. In addition, refugees who arrived in Nakivale are also given a rather generous aid package. On one hand, they're given a plot of land that they can produce on and also settle on. And in addition, they're also eligible to food aid delivery from the World Food Programme. I think a little different from other presenters in our today's session, the food aid delivered in Nakivale is only in kind and there's no additional cash assistance. However, the food aid is still very crucial for the refugees to survive. And in 2015, it has become quite under strain. What happened was that a large influx of around 138,000 South Sudanese refugees entered the country from the north. And suddenly, World Food Programme Uganda had to service a much larger number of refugees than expected, and therefore had certain funding shortages, which they had to resolve. They did so by setting the cutoff to 2013, such that refugees who arrived before 2013 have lived in the country at this point for at least 2 years or more, and have been deemed perhaps more self-reliant, and their food entitlements were reduced by 50%. Refugees who arrived after 2013 were classified as recent arrivals, and they remained eligible for the full ration entitlements. This is how it looked like in terms of entitlements. So the full ration is on the left-hand side, and it is supposed to deliver the average calories needed for an adult of around 2,400 kilocalories per day, most of them coming from cereals, pulses, corn, soy bland, and vegetable oil. Refugees who were on reduced rations, so those arriving before 2013, only received a half ration, which, as you can see, in fact, means significantly less calories, even more than half, which goes from 2,400 down to just around 1,100. In our data, the discontinuity looks like this. On the x-axis, we have reported arrival date, and on the y-axis, we have the ration that a refugee has received. We can see that both in terms of maize and in terms of beans consumed, or rather included in the ration, refugees on the left-hand side of the cutoff have received just around 50% of the ration size than refugees on the right-hand side of the cutoff. There is a very clear and large discontinuity visible around 2013, showing that those that arrived afterwards have had significantly higher rations than those arriving beforehand. If no other variable has changed significantly around the cutoff, what we can do is use a regression discontinuity design to estimate the treatment effect of ration reductions. This would be achieved by taking a small narrow window around the cutoff, around 2013, and comparing the refugees on the left-hand side to those who are just on the right-hand side of the cutoff. And if there's no significant other difference between those two groups except then the food policy, then the difference in means between outcomes in these two groups, roughly speaking, would translate to the treatment effect that we would observe in terms of food ration reductions. The main assumption made here is that no other variable had a discontinuous jump at around 2013, which is the continuity assumption of an RDD. We do have a couple of reasons to expect this continuity assumption to hold. For one particular problem that we very often face with regression discontinuity designs is an anticipation effect. If individuals, for example, are able to anticipate a policy, they would have an incentive to self-select into the group that is more favorable for them. In our paper, we would have a large problem if refugees arriving around 2013 would have the opportunity to self-select and, for example, postpone their arrival for a couple of months and therefore arrive after the cutoff and therefore be part of the control group. However, in our setting, this is very unlikely or actually even impossible to have occurred because the policy came into effect in 2015 and uses a retrospective cutoff, which means refugees who were arriving in 2013 had no means to actually anticipate a policy that would happen 2 years in the future, and therefore would not be able to anticipate a policy and change their arrival date accordingly. In addition, the policy was unexpected. It was unexpected both for the refugees and the policymakers, in fact, in 2015, because it was a direct response to a crisis that emerged in the country through a sudden and unexpected arrival of 138,000 South Sudanese refugees. This arrival can be interpreted as a quasi-exogenous shock, and that led to the World Food Programme experiencing funding shortages, and in conclusion, to the food policy. We might be somewhat worried that if a large amount of refugees arrived into the country, Nakivale and refugees living in the camp would be affected in different ways than just the food policy. For example, through changes in the labor market or perhaps the composition of refugees in the camp. However, the influx of refugees into Uganda was really limited to the northern parts of the state. Not really many South Sudanese refugees moved into the south where Nakivale is located, and in fact, in our data set, there's not a single South Sudanese refugee. Therefore, we would expect the impact on Nakivale to have not been really significant, except for the change in the nationwide food policy from WFP. Since there have been very few exceptions to some extremely vulnerable individuals, and also the elderly, our regression's continuity design is fuzzy, which does not have significantly strong implications for our results, except they will be applying to the subset of compliers and not the whole refugee sample. Given that the continuity assumptions are holding, we can use different RD estimators to estimate the treatment effect of food ration reductions. And we do so by using state-of-the-art typical estimators developed by Polonico et al. We also cluster our standard errors at the enumeration error level in order to incorporate the survey design, which has also been a very typical one. We use a two-stage sample clustering, where first enumeration areas were drawn, those were villages, and then a mapping exercise was performed afterwards. We then draw a set of households from each EA. And since we were stratifying by nationality, our sample ends up being representative of both refugee communities in Nakivale and the two biggest refugee communities, which are the Somali and Congolese refugees. The survey was conducted between March and April 2018, and on total we have around 1,600 refugees in our sample, 800 Somali and 800 Congolese. So applying our RD estimates into our data, these are the main results that we find. Perhaps a quick note on interpretation. Similarly to the regression's continuity literature in general, we compare the right-hand side of the cutoff to the left-hand side of the cutoff. However, if you remember, what is a bit different is that in our case, the right-hand side of the cutoff comprises the control group on higher rations, and the left-hand side, the treatment group, which experienced ration reductions, which means if we see a positive coefficient in this table, it means that those on higher rations also had higher outcomes than individuals on lower rations. For example, if we look into our preferred specification, which is panel B, a non-parametric estimation using control variables, which are gender, age, marital status, and educational attainment of the parents, we see that refugees on higher food rations had on average a significantly higher calorie intake. They also spent significantly more on food, are slightly less food insecure, and slightly more likely to travel to other parts of Uganda. We did not see any sort of impact on dietary variety, health, or the likelihood of having a job. If we translate these treatment estimates so that they relate to ration reductions, what we have just found was that refugees in lower rations consumed on average 36% less calories per week, which means 530 kilocalories per day. And they also spend around 35% less on food. The second part might be curious, since it implies that aid and expenditure are complements and not substitutes. And we might have expected that when rations are reduced, individuals would have to spend more to make up for the difference, but in fact, they spend less. One potential explanation for this could be a common and quite widespread practice, especially among Somali refugees, of ration selling. Very often Somalis for whom the contents of the rations are actually not culturally inappropriate food, would use parts of their rations, sell them in the market, and then use the cash received in order to buy the sorts of foods that they enjoy consuming. And therefore, when rations are reduced, automatically also their cash is reduced and therefore expenditure. That could be one potential reason. What we saw is that refugees on lower rations were also more food insecure by around 5 points on the FIA score of insecurity. Lower rations were also associated with less travel between Nakivale and other cities, which is also actually a good result, or rather a result that helps in our identification, since it seems to be the case that it's only refugees who have higher rations who are able to move out of the camp and pursue other economic opportunities in other cities. One thing that we would have been worried by is if refugees who have experienced ration reductions would leave the camp, as then our treatment group would have been a little bit contaminated. However, what looks to be the case is that in order to leave the camp and have other economic opportunities, it is necessary to have a higher ration, or at least those on lower rations are more likely to move. We did not observe any sort of impact on dietary variety, on health, or the likelihood of being employed. And the second part has really made us curious, as we would have also expected that once individuals are faced with ration reductions, they would need to search for new income earning opportunities in order to make up for the negative income shock, which is also something we found with recent studies on COVID. But it is not the case, and there could be two potential reasons for this. First, that even though Uganda has a very progressive policy environment, having a job and finding one in Nakivale is actually still quite challenging, as there are not as many economic opportunities available, and the refugees have to also compete with locals. Plus, very often refugees would need education certificates or just other certificates to prove their skills, which they do not possess, and therefore their competitiveness in the market might be hindered. A different reason could be that there is underlying heterogeneity in our populations, and that, for example, you could imagine if one portion of the refugees in our sample would have positive treatment effects and others would have had negative ones, then when we aggregate them together, it could be that the aggregate effect is not discernible from zero. We look into this second hypothesis by splitting our sample into the two main subgroups of refugees that live in Nakivale, the Somalis and the Congolese refugees. There are actually a couple of reasons why we would expect the treatment effects to differ between those two groups. For one, their background is rather different. Somali refugees come from an urban background and are very often well connected within their network. They have a large Somali network both within the camp, within Uganda, and also between different countries that they might be able to rely on in times of need. Congolese refugees tend to not have that sort of network. Second of all, because Somalis have an urban background, what we very often observed was that once they arrived in the camp, they were allotted a plot of agricultural land, but they would immediately sell this agricultural land because they would not be able to actually produce anything on it, and instead use the proceeds to move into the settlement and then pursue trade and service activities. Congolese refugees, by contrast, tend to have a much higher likelihood of keeping the agricultural land that they have been allotted and actually then also engaging in agriculture. Agricultural tends to be the most engaged in occupation from all occupations for the Congolese subsample. So because of that, we would have actually expected the impacts on calorie consumption for the Congolese sample to be a little bit lower, because since they are very often engaged in subsistence agriculture, it should have been the case that once rations are reduced, they might have been able to produce something themselves and therefore balance the shock. However, what we observe is actually quite different, as the impact effect on the Congolese is significantly higher than the impact effect on Somalis. So Congolese have been significantly negatively affected by ration reductions, whilst for Somalis, we cannot actually tell if they have been positively or negatively impacted at all. In addition, what we can see for Congolese refugees is that they are more incentivized to look for additional jobs, whilst for Somalis, it actually appears to be the case that they are slightly less likely to look for a job opportunity if they are experiencing ration reductions. There is a second curiosity for Somali refugees, which we will investigate, and this is dietary variety. The way we would need to interpret the coefficient under dietary variety in panel A is that Somali refugees who have experienced ration reductions are in fact having slightly more varied diets than Somalis who have not experienced ration reductions. They also tend to exhibit around 2.7 less health problems than Somalis on higher rations. To summarize these points,
at 17 minutes, please.
Thank you. To summarize these points, we have seen that the effect of weekly calories is significantly higher for Congolese refugees than for Somalis. Dietary variety is higher than the number of health problems lower for Somalis on reduced rations. Somalis on reduced rations also less likely to work. Employment therefore does not seem to be a coping strategy for Somalis, but it does very much seem like a coping strategy for Congolese refugees once they experience reduced rations. We will now very quickly look into both of the individual groups, once for Somalis and Congolese, to see what might have been going on. For Somalis, the big question was why Somalis on lower rations are able to work less and why they have more varied diets. We looked into this and by looking on one hand on remittances and on the other hand on food consumption. On the food consumption end, we see that what is most likely going on is that Somalis are substituting foods which they prefer in their diet with foods that are included in the ration. The Somali diet usually tends to be very meat heavy, whilst the contents of the rations, like maize, cereals, and beans that you've seen before, tend to be not considered culturally appropriate foods. The impact estimates in this table tell us that Somalis, when they experience ration reductions, tend to consume significantly less meat, and instead they consume significantly more beans and nuts. We cannot say that maize, cereals, potatoes consumption is significantly different. However, the coefficient does signal that it seems that Somalis are consuming more of these parts of the ration, although it's not completely significant. Therefore, it does seem to be the case that experiencing ration reductions means that they move away from their typical meat consumption and therefore increase the sorts of foods like beans, nuts, maize, cereals, and potatoes. These foods, however, are also significantly more calorically dense, which increases the calorie count for them, and also more varied, which therefore increases dietary variety. So what seems to be going on is that while rations have had an initial negative impact on their caloric consumption, the substitution in foods that is going on afterwards does mitigate this a little bit, since they tend to consume more varied and slightly more calorically dense foods. Somalis also have a very strong network within their community, and it seems to be the case that they are able to rely on this network in times of needs. Looking at both the extensive and intensive margin of receiving remittances, Somalis are significantly more likely to receive remittances if they experience ration reductions. Also, the monthly amount received tends to be higher, although not completely significant, although significant at the 11th percent level. Congolese refugees are slightly different, however, since they cannot rely on this internal network, and therefore, as we have seen before, are more likely to have to start a new economic opportunity. What we wanted to look into is if we split the job dummy into agricultural work and non-agricultural work, from which sort of type of occupation does the increase in labor supply come from? And what is very interesting for us to see is that, in fact, it is increased supply in non-agricultural work that drives the results on the job dummy. Congolese refugees, therefore, who have experienced reduced rations increase their supply to non-agricultural work, although they actually have an agricultural background, and therefore the agricultural works could be a competitive advantage for them. We looked into this through a little bit of focus discussions and qualitative interviews, and what seems to be going on is that the land quality and the sustainability of agricultural jobs has changed over time. As more and more refugees have entered the camp, there has been just a fixed amount of land available, and therefore the same amount of land had to be allocated to more and more refugees. The average plot sizes have therefore very slowly but steadily over time reduced. Sometimes even plots had to be reallocated, which means that if one is a refugee arriving in the camp, it could be the case that within the next couple of years, your plot of land would be reallocated to a different refugee, because the land ownership still lies within the country, the government. This means that there is no incentive to really invest in the plot of land, but rather an incentive to extract a lot of resources out of the land, which is what we have observed. In fact, land quality over time has decreased and therefore made agricultural jobs less and less sustainable. In summary, we saw that refugee communities adopted different coping strategies. Somalis with lower food rations consumed fewer preferred food items, and they substituted them with other items, which were cheaper, parts of the ration, but also richer in calories and a little bit more diverse. Somalis were in general better connected, and those with lower food rations could therefore rely on their remittances network in order to balance a negative shock. Congolese did not have such a network and therefore had to increase their labor supply in order to balance the shock. And they did so by increasing supply to non-agricultural jobs, because agricultural jobs has become less and less sustainable due to a decreasing land availability over time and decreasing land quality. We have run through a couple of robustness checks, which out of interest of time, I'm not going to go through now, but of course results would be available upon request if we wish to. But in general speaking, our results are robust to all these different specifications that you can see on the slide. To conclude, refugees subject to ration cuts have experienced significant declines in caloric intake and food expenditure, around 35 to 36%. They are also for more food insecure by around 5 scales on the FIA's food insecurity scale. We've also seen that coping strategies have differed by refugee nationality, such that Somalis have substituted preferred items with cheaper ones from their ration, which are, however, also richer in calories, and they have been able to rely on their remittances network to balance the negative income shock. Congolese refugees did not have access to such a network, and instead they have become more and more involved in non-agricultural jobs. In conclusion, we can say that it does not seem completely likely that self-reliance has been achieved in the long run, and both of our refugee groups are still quite significantly reliant on food rations, and a negative shock to these rations has forced them to use quite a couple of coping strategies. On this point, I would like to conclude and thank you all very much for, I see a question on sharing. I'm sure that all presentations will be shared, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Mirko. It was such a wonderful presentation and thought-provoking evidence. So to everyone, all the participants, if you could type your questions, please. We see that we have already a couple of questions from George and also from Adnan. And I also would like to mention that this session is being live broadcasted in YouTube. So there might be some questions in that platform also. If Agnes could help me with that, please. So Mirko, maybe you can take like 3 questions because we don't have much time left. So maybe take 3 questions from the chat.
Yes, absolutely.
Those,
so the first one, could you tell us about some potential weather shocks that may have affected the results, which would be food supply? And second, it would be nice to look at ethnicity composition. I'm thinking about some cooperation channel between members of the same ethnicity. Thanks again. Very, very interesting points indeed. As for weather shocks, we've so far not looked into matching weather data to this particular time, but this would be a very interesting thing to look into. In terms of identification, what would have needed to happen is that there would have had to be a shock just around the 2013 cutoff that would have had to be immediate and very short-lived, because we are looking into a more narrow window around the 2013 cutoff. And then it would have to affect just one of the 2 groups, which could be very interesting for the Congolese refugees as they're agriculturally reliant. But that might not necessarily explain the impact on the Somalis refugees, since all Somalis would be engaged in opportunities that perhaps are not directly impacted by weather changes. But I will definitely write this down. In addition, ethnicity composition. I'm thinking about cooperation channels between members of the same ethnicity. This could also be something to look into. That is very useful, as we do ask in our questionnaire a couple of questions in terms of the perceptions of both refugees and the host community, and perhaps also between each others. But we have not yet looked into these informal channels between the ethnicities yet. Our understanding so far has been that refugees tend to stick to their own communities and rely on these communities very much. So we have not, for example, seen any sort of changes in the remittances network of Congolese refugees or help from their own community. Whilst also for the Somalis, we have seen an uptake in remittances, but we have not seen an uptake, for example, through informal lending within their own community. Thank you very much for both of these. And what we have here? What were some key conclusions, especially in terms of government and/or agency policy approaches? Second, did the study go outside the camp settlements into the local community, and what were the comparable or otherwise counter-granular findings of the course implications? Perhaps on the first one. As I see our study, what we are really trying to achieve first and foremost is opening up the black box that is ration reductions. So in the past, it has not really been possible to look into what is actually the impact of a ration reduction, as there has been a lot of study looking into, for example, what is the impact of cash assistance or in-kind assistance. It is still a different situation when such assistance is withdrawn from communities. And because very often these situations tend to be very reactive and therefore not having any sort of exogenous variation to them, there's actually very little knowledge about how individuals react in terms of these related to ration reductions. So I think, first added benefit is opening up the black box and understanding just per se what happens in refugee communities when they are subject to such ration reductions, which I think many of us know is something that happens not just once, but actually regularly because of several funding shortages. So for policymakers, I think the first step before implementing a policy would be to look into what are the consequences of these policies. And I think this is where we come in and help them understand a little bit better of what might be going on. And the second point that is very important to highlight is that there has been very important heterogeneity between the refugee groups, which is related also to their background, to their economic upbringing and their skills that they have. And for policymakers to keep in mind is that refugees are very different in terms of the communities and also in terms of their skills and coping strategies. Therefore, when one particular policy is implemented, these differences might materialize in very different ways and therefore also lead to different types of vulnerabilities that governments should be aware of.
Okay, Marco, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For everyone, so this is the only paper of this session that the link was not provided for the full paper. So maybe after the conference, we can share the email address of Marco so that he can share the paper with everyone. So
yes,
thank you, Marco, again for such a wonderful presentation. So in case they can, I'll be in touch with a couple of questions later. But right now, let's get to the second paper. It is Children on the Move, Progressive Redistribution of Humanitarian Cash Transfers Among Refugees. The paper presents the results of the impact of the emergency social safety net in Turkey. This is the largest cash transfer program of international refugees in the world. The paper is authored by Bart Osler, Sigden Selick, Scott Cunningham, Fukando Sivas, and Luca Perisotto. On behalf of the team, Bart Osler will present the paper. Bart, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Azam. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Stop the video.
Great. Yes, this paper is with Chidem and Facundo, who were at the country office of the World Bank at the time. I'm in the research department of the World Bank. So is Luca Perisotto working with me, and Scott Cunningham is at Baylor University. I want to say a few things about these types of studies before we get going. One of the things is this conference was supposed to be a year ago, and back then this was very much work in progress and a working paper. Now it's actually published in the Journal of Development Economics, and economists around here will know that it's very difficult to publish papers with kind of propensity score matching types of identification strategies these days. And I wanted to say that it is actually possible to do good, careful work that's both academically interesting and very useful for the program implementers and policymakers. If you kind of plan ahead and go carefully through your statistical and rhetorical arguments for kind of identification strategies and be very transparent about what all the limitations of your study is and kind of like what you're able to identify and what are the kind of question marks. The second thing is more substantively on the kind of like what's happening in Turkey with this cash transfer program for largely Syrian refugees, although the program is for all refugees, but 90% of refugees in Turkey are from Syria. Over the 18-month period between 2018 and 2020, we see very large positive trends for the control group throughout the period, and with some small impacts on some of the outcomes that I'll show later. This actually is good news for the refugee population as a whole and not just the beneficiaries of the program. And then finally, the main result from here that you might have anticipated seeing the title and the abstract is that, the refugees actually reacted to their eligibility status, seem to have, by, rearranging their households in a very interesting way. And so, one thing I think to understand from cash transfer or transfer programs in general is that these programs will always be good. So that's not in question. But the question is, how can we design them better? How can, what are the important design parameters to think about? And kind of like, what are the alternative uses of that money, and what are the complementary interventions that we can do along with cash transfer programs? And I think this paper kind of gives some hints towards that, and we try to take it there as much as possible, is that while refugees support each other through networks, this is not always, optimal. Maybe this is the second best or third best solution. And the first bait might have been that this program could have been designed slightly differently to have different effects. And then I'll show you what I mean by that in a few minutes. Now, a little background on the program in Turkey. Turkey is currently home to nearly 4 million refugees, about 3.6 of them Syrian. These are all, by the way, numbers from, let's say, relevant to 2020, not the last 2 years. The vast majority of refugees work in informal low-wage jobs, and they have access to public services, but coverage gap remain. The ESSN was co-implemented by the Turkish government, the World Food Programme, and the Turkish Red Crescent after a large infusion of cash from the EU to support refugees. And it currently supports close to 2 million people as of March 2020 in Turkey, which is about 50% of the refugee population. So the eligibility was kind of very deterministic. There's a dependency ratio, and families with children are the main really criteria that bite. There are not a lot of single female households or elderly aided households or single parent households, and there's some disability. And Turkey has quite a sophisticated social protection infrastructure, in which there is these, Kızılay is the Turkish name for Turkish Red Crescent. There's these Kızılay cards through which both Turks and refugees access their assistance. The transfers actually at the time the program was designed were quite generous, and 120 Turkish lira per person, which amounted to about $60 in 2011 PPPs. And then there are kind of quarterly top-ups based on household size. Now, the ESSN program, it stands for Social Safety Net, is integrated into Turkey's social protection infrastructure, which is really seen as kind of international best practice. Essentially, once you're in the system, the databases about 20 different public institutions can instantly come together for your family and verify your eligibility, and all sorts of things happen. You get your disability reports, your latest disability reports uploaded, your address, your records with the Ministry of Labor, let's say, and things like that. So it's a system that's not only sophisticated, but it's kind of quite hard to game. And the officials were actually quite strict about kind of who is eligible and who is not. So, and then ideally, social workers are supposed to make household visits within a year of application to verify some of the information, but the criteria are also regularly kind of digitally checked on a monthly basis. So for example, if there's a new birth into your household, an ineligible household can become eligible, or a disability report is kind of withdrawn and this person is no longer considered disabled, or somebody reaches age 19 and no longer a child, etc., vice versa, right? Once a household is registered, however, it can be difficult to change the data on the application, with maybe some delays and things like that. So while the system is hard to game, there can be discrepancies in household characteristics between the actual household characteristics and what is in the registries, right? This can be due to lack of documentation, literally typos on names and things like that. Linking household members who have been registered at different times and so on, right? So our colleagues, Chidem and Facundo, along with WFP and Turkish Red Crescent, were involved in kind of designing this study before we were asked to come on board to help. And the random sample of almost 9,000 households stratified from 5 regions of Turkey was drawn. And it's important to note that this sample was drawn about 4 or 5 months after people were start the application process. The decisions on their eligibility were already made, but they were not announced. And definitely the transfers had not started. They didn't start until June of 2018. June of 20, I think that's a mistake, 2017. I think it should be 2018. And then the transfer started kind of immediately after the baseline surveys, which happened between February and May. And then we have 3 rounds of 6-month, 12-month, and 18-month follow-up surveys on our primary outcomes. These are all phone surveys designed by the World Food Programme with inputs from our World Bank colleagues and collected by the Turkish Red Crescent. There was a 4th round that was supposed to happen in early 2020, but the pandemic hit and it never happened. So we're left with 3 follow-up surveys. Now, I mentioned earlier that there might be lots of study limitations, and it's good to be transparent about those. I'm going to go over them here because it's actually quite informative to just kind of know what kinds of things you might do to address some of these things, which are likely to be common in studies where the conditions for evaluation are less than ideal. So the first thing is, of course, this program wasn't randomly assigned. So in the end, after looking at all the options available to us that were non-experimental, we decided on an inverse probability weighting scenario. And essentially, you're estimating kind of how likely is a household that I see at my baseline survey is to be eligible for the program. And the propensity scores essentially kind of tell you, well, these ones that have very low probabilities and these ones have very high probabilities. And you can see that with ones with very low probabilities, 90% of them are in the control group, and then very few are in the treatment group. But there are enough in the treatment group that I can actually match these households to each other and upweight these guys to just kind of get an estimate of kind of the effect of the program for these people compared to these people. At the other extreme, when somebody is extremely likely to be in the program, such as they have 5 children or they have a dependency ratio of 2 or something like that, then you can see that 90% of them are in the treatment group, about 10% in the control. But again, there are enough people who somehow ended up in the control group due to some mistakes, etc., that I can again match them and upweight the control group to just get an estimate here. And in the middle, actually, we have literally a 50-50 split, kind of like people who are sort of likely to be eligible. They seem to be equally likely to have ended up in the treatment and control. So you can see that here there's a little balance table. Before we do our propensity score weighting, the treatment group looks very different than the control group. It's almost bigger by like a 1.25 people, much larger dependency ratios, the kind of like their coping strategy scores are lower, their per capita expenditures are lower, so on and so forth. But after we match, all of those things go away, we get very good balance. And then actually the joint orthogonality test here is kind of like 0.9, which is very good, right? So that's the statistical bit. The rhetorical bit here is that, well, you might say, well, how did this happen? Why are people who are very likely to be eligible not eligible? And the best we can tell is that these are literally random bureaucratic mistakes that are due to discrepancies between de facto household status and the de jure status that's in the system, right? So for example, if a family had been split somehow, and then, but there was no other differences between 2 families. One had their registrations in different times for different people, and then the other one all together. And then later on, it was difficult to kind of link people's registrations. As a result, one of them ended up eligible, the other one didn't. There isn't really much substantively different between these households, but there's bureaucratic reasons why initially one was deemed eligible and the other not, right? So second thing quickly to talk about is attrition. And our study really suffers from high and differential attrition, meaning we're losing about like third to, by the end, almost like a half of the sample we're fortunate that it's a very large sample. So even losing people, we still have decent amount of power, but there's also imbalance. We're losing more of the control group, and we're particularly losing more of the more vulnerable control group. So there's no way to get around this, that as the data we have, we essentially had planned to fix this in the fourth round, the 24-month follow-up, but which never happened. But this is actually not hard to fix. I will say that the Turkish Red Crescent was essentially quite conservative in their practices of data collection. They only called people a few times and then gave up. And we've essentially showed, and I've actually written a blog post about this on development impact that you can read, that if you actually put in strict protocols on how many times you're going to call people at what times of the day and in the evening and on weekends and things like that, you can easily get your follow-up rates much, much higher. We did a pilot before the pandemic, and we got easily to kind of 92% success rate instead of these ones that we're now stuck with in the first three follow-up rounds. So because there's no getting around this, we essentially bound all of our impact estimates. And what that means is that, if we lost the control group, we say, well, look, what if all of the control group that were lost were going to have the best outcomes possible in all of our outcome indicators, and what if the treatment group that were lost were going to have the worst outcomes possible? What would the impact have been? And then we can do vice versa, and then get a lower bound and an upper bound on the estimates, and we show all of those in all tables in the paper rather than sticking these into an appendix. The third thing to mention is that, as I said, because the eligibility status is being checked digitally monthly, over time, the control group becomes eligible, and you can see that kind of like by the end, 42% of the initial control group is actually getting transfers. And then, some of the eligible groups is also losing eligibility. So then the effective difference in eligibility, instead of being 100%, it's actually 72% at 6 months, and then all the way down to 37% at 18 months. Right? Finally, I call this slide a SUTVA violation because it's actually a threat to identification, because there are huge spillover effects. But this is also the main finding of our study, which is that we see a huge movement of children from better off to less well-off households. And to read these things, essentially, I want to, let's say, show you here, look at the 6-month household size on the vertical axis. You have the change in household size between baseline and 6 months after the baseline. And then on the horizontal axis, you have the propensity score. And then this group is the treatment group, and this group is the control group. And you can see that these are the kind of least vulnerable refugee households in the treatment group. They're growing by about half a person within 6 months. Whereas the least vulnerable control group, there's no change in their household sizes. As you go along, however, you see that now the worst of treatment group aren't really growing in their household size, but the worst of control group are shrinking by about a person. And on this panel, we just focus on, instead of total household size, children under the age of 17. And you can see that all of that change pretty much is due to the movement of children, right? If I clicked on some of these characteristics here, you can see that the households that lost children from the control group and the households from treatment that gained children from the treatment group are very, very different. The ones that are losing children are really big households, lots of children, low per capita consumption, not attending school, more likely to be female-headed, and so on, right? So essentially, we're seeing kind of like this churn among households of children moving. And I should note that this is not just from control group to treatment group. This is happening from control to control, even treatment to treatment. It's just that it's happening from worse off households to better off households, and the net effect of that is a movement of children from control group to the treatment group. Now, this is a finding in and of itself that has policy implications, but it also is an identification assumption violation in that if there are spillovers now, it's much harder for me to say what is the impact, the traditional intention to treat effect of this program on people, because that would assume no spillover effects. The control group would be pure and not be benefiting or suffering from the fact that there are other people around them who are being treated. So how we interpret our estimates is that it's not actually the intention to treat, but the value of treatment, which is that given that there are people around you who are being treated, what is the value of being treated for you, right? So with the COVID pandemic, you can think of this very easily. You can actually think of kind of a being in a community where 99% of the people around you are booster vaccinated. They have their 3 vaccines right now. So if you're actually afraid of side effects like myocarditis or blood clots, or if you have extreme aversion to jabs and you're afraid of needles and things like that, the value of treatment for you could well be 0 or negative because you're completely protected. So the benefits of getting the jab is close to 0. And then there's actually a cost. Whereas if you're living in a community that's 50% vaccinated, then value of treatment for you, value of getting the jab could be huge, right? So you have to think of our estimates here in that way, is that there is the effects of the treatment on the beneficiaries that is pure, plus there is the spillover effects, and it's going to be the combination of those things that we see. So when we see 0 effects on a lot of outcomes or even negative ones, it doesn't necessarily mean that the program had no effect. It just means might mean that the program actually helped both the beneficiaries and the non-beneficiaries. So with that, let's quickly run through our primary outcomes, and then we'll be finished in a few minutes. And I hope that I'm on time, Dr. Azad.
You're at 19 minutes. I didn't want to stop you.
Okay, perfect. I'll stop in like 3 minutes or so. So on the left-hand side panel here, you see total consumption, and the treatment group is always red and the control group is blue. You can see that total consumption is going up, even though it kind of starts kind of like converging by 18 months. But if you look at per capita consumption on the right-hand side, you notice that the colors flip, meaning that the treatment effect actually on per capita consumption is negative and significant. And this is tautologically a function of the fact that the treatment group is much larger now than the control group in household size. So when we divide a larger number by a bigger household size, this is the outcome that we get. So if you only cared about this outcome, and you said, well, like maybe I should have just not been a beneficiary and send my kid to like my cousins, and I would have been better off per capita consumption, there might be a point there. But let's see a few other outcomes here. So this is the total stock of debt. And you can see that these refugee households are quite indebted. Like at the baseline, they're about 1,200 Turkish liras, which is a large sum. And you can see that for the treatment group, that is gone down by like 30 to 40%. And it actually stays open throughout the entire period, that gap, rather than kind of converging. This is the WFP's food consumption score. The treatment group is doing better. So unlike the previous paper we saw, they're actually eating kind of more diverse foods. And we got into the weeds in this. We see that they're eating more fruits and vegetables and more proteins from animals that come from animals, such as dairy, eggs, meat, and fish. And this is interesting because their per capita consumptions are lower. So either they're making a quality quantity trade-off, or there's some reporting problem here where they haven't internalized the more expensive costs of the things that they're buying, or maybe there's some adult equivalence issues where because children are joining the household, there's more opportunities kind of like compared to per capita. But nonetheless, we do see slightly more diverse consumption in the treatment group. The coping strategies are actually not, like at the 6 months treatment group is doing a little bit better, but that quickly converges and sometimes even reverse themselves. Schooling trends are actually nice in the sense that you can see in the baseline, less than 50% of the kids are in school, but at the end of the study period, it's up to 70%. no difference between treated and control households. But we do, on the right-hand panel, we see some heterogeneity where the most vulnerable households, treatment seems to be having an effect on school attendance rather than not. Some of you may have questions about the CCT program for schooling that was happening simultaneously in Turkey. There's a nice little explanation and an appendix analyzing that in the paper. If you're interested, we don't have time to go into it here. And the biggest message here is that the FGT0 stands for the headcount index here. You can see that about 25% of the refugees are below the $3.20 poverty line at baseline. And that is essentially halved, regardless of which group you're in. In fact, it's more reduced in the control group than the treatment group, which is a function of the per capita expenditure results that I've shown you. Inequality is down also tremendously in the entire refugee population, not just in the beneficiary group. Especially, you can see the Gini goes down from 26 points to 21, 22 points, which for those of you who study inequality, if you see a 1 point difference, that's kind of a significant difference. So within 18 months to have a 5 percentage point decline is a huge decline. So we can't, this is a before after comparison, strictly speaking. So we can't attribute all of this to the cash transfer program. But if you ask me, I would have said the cash transfer program must have helped. And these reductions in poverty are, yes, some of it is time trends, but some of it is the help that they're getting. These are the CDFs that you can see. Essentially, what's happening is you're seeing that this is 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and essentially these cumulative distribution functions of per capita consumption dominate the baseline, meaning that poverty is lower for every poverty line between the 320 and 550. By 550 or so, some of the lines start crossing. And then let's conclude. The program led to some improvements in total consumption and food security, and then these households have also a little less debt. There is some evidence that we find that the transfer might have crowded out some labor market earnings. We see that by the end of the study period, the control group is earning about 100 liras more than the treatment group on average in the labor market. And the thing that I want to end with is essentially this idea that, well, look, maybe it would have been best to have more budget for this program so that we could have treated more people with the same amount of money, and that would have limited some of this movement of children that we seem to be detecting. But even in a budget neutral program, we could have actually avoided some of this by giving smaller transfers to a larger number of households. And in particular, one could consider universal child support grants or old age pensions that could allow all refugee households to adequately support these populations while you do your targeting for able-bodied adults, etc. I know that like Owner's paper and others have kind of like pointed at different targeting mechanisms for refugees. These weren't available at the time for the Turkish, the ESSN, but may be useful in the future. And let me stop there and thank you so much.
Thanks, Park. You are right at 25 minutes time. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's actually great to learn about the impact of this world's largest cash transfer program for international refugees. I'm sure these results will inform future policies and programs for refugees in refugee host countries. Thank you. On this note, let me direct to the audience in case you have any questions. If you could please type them over here. And please, Agnes, if there are questions in our YouTube platform. Over. And also to mention that Mark's co-author Stephen O'Connell, so he mentioned something about this paper on the chat platform. So let's take a look. We don't have any question on the YouTube platform yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat. I mean, I talked about the trade-off at the end of the talk. We didn't have enough time, but we write about it like in a decent amount of detail in the paper. I do really think that, you know, I mean, I've been working on cash transfers for about 15 years. The amounts at the time that this program was designed and started per person are quite generous. So, you know, these would have amounted to kind of like close to 50% of household consumption at baseline or something like that. Whereas it's not uncommon to see anywhere from like 5 to 20%, like even in the most generous programs, 22% would be the highest that I would know of. So it might have been better to think about, well, you know, if we're anticipating these kinds of responses by households who are living close to each other and who have networks, you know, let's just try to cover many more people and then have kind of like a smaller per capita transfer amount. I think that could have been, of course, we don't have the experiment to see how that would have gone, but that would have been my informed speculation. And then Stephen has some questions, but I think they're just kind of too detailed for time here. I just will respond to those by email. Stephen, if you write me an email, I can respond to those if they're not answered in the paper themselves. And then finally, I think that we did get a lot of questions asked on the CCT program for schooling. We actually have this speculation where the CCT transfers still go to the parents in the registry, right? So if a child is registered with their household and they're not eligible for ESSN, but when the child goes to another household and goes to school, the money would still go to the parents in the original household. So we actually think that like these household reorganizations might have been beneficial in two ways to the sending family. One is that they have one less mouth to feed and the child is better off there, but also that if in their own household, the child wouldn't have been able to go to school and would have had to work or something like that, and it does in the other household, you get an extra 50, 100 Turkish lira for that child's school attendance. So it's not actually a kind of like a contrast or a reason why we don't find effects. In fact, we think that it's a kind of like a complementary story. And let me stop there so that others can have enough time for their own presentations after me.
You're muted, Azad.
Can you hear me? Okay. I guess you can. Thank you, Bart, for your presentation. Perfect. Thank you very much for your presentation. Let's get to the third presentation. The third paper is the short-lived effects of unconditional cash transfers to refugees. In this paper, Onur Altindag and Stephen O'Connor studied the effect of year-long unconditional cash-based assistance programs for Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So on behalf of the team, Onur will present the results. Over to you, Onur.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a great pleasure to be here for the second time. And thanks, Berk and Mirko, for setting the stage. I try to live up to their standard. And I'm going to present joint work with Stephen O'Connell from Emory University, and I teach at Bentley University here in Boston. Steve is on the chat, so please do not hesitate to ask any questions, and he will simultaneously answer. In this paper, we're presenting the results from a study in Lebanon. We're looking at the impact of unconditional cash transfers on the well-being of refugees in the short run and a little bit longer term. We would like to thank the UNHCR staff in Lebanon, our colleagues, for their help and patience with us. We do not represent their views here, but we're grateful for their support. So let me just motivate the topic a little bit. Unconditional cash transfers are very popular anti-poverty tools. Currently, more than 100 countries rely on UCTs to alleviate poverty. Their immediate benefits are extensively studied in economic development literature. They're popular for a reason. They're transparent, they're easy to implement, and they directly target the credit constraints, which we assume are the cornerstones of poverty. So they also have the potential to move impoverished households to a better and sustained equilibrium through relaxing credit constraints and generate savings, asset of purchase of productive assets, and avoiding on relying on expensive credit. The UCTs have become so popular actually that the structure of the social protection programs in humanitarian settings changed as well. Currently, a large share of the humanitarian aid is distributed through cash-based programs, through United Nations-led response plans, in the hopes that they can achieve both immediate relief and help with day-to-day coping mechanisms, but also longer-term poverty alleviation and self-reliance for the refugee population. But obviously, poverty is multidimensional, and anti-poverty programs might need to address multiple issues that create these poverty traps. And in that aspect, the longer-term success of these programs vary a lot. And there are, if you just look at the literature, you can see that there are two kind of things that show up. One is that matters. One is the core design features. The transfer values are important. The amount of transfer that you provide to the beneficiaries, the duration of the program, and also how the transfers are used is important. And recent evidence actually suggests that the purchase of productive assets and migration are key drivers of a longer-term prosperity and more sustained effects. And secondly, beneficiaries matter as well, like how much initial capital endowment they have. Do they have market access, especially labor and insurance market matters. And an existing institutional framework obviously is important, especially the legal framework in the setting. And you can see that some of these issues are actually highly salient in our context, which is forced migration, as refugees live in a transitional state with very limited access to some of the markets and legal support in the host country. And we think that some of these issues actually might explain the results that I'm gonna present here. So our main kind of question that we're trying to answer in this paper is the cash-based assistance to the refugee population, is that a tool for temporary relief, but can it provide longer-term sustained benefits? And so we estimate during and after programs of two large at-scale cash transfer programs. These programs are year-long, 1-year programs, and our main argument in this paper is that actually these programs are very effective in providing temporary relief in multiple measures of economic well-being. But the observed effects dissipate shortly after. I mean, we're talking about a 6-month time frame. They dissipate right after the program ends, and we try to explain why. The two programs that we study are quite large in terms of transfer values, both in absolute and relative terms. So one program, which is a multi-purpose cash program, provides over $2,000 per year per household. Another one provides around $1,600 per household, and a large number of families are eligible for these programs, which also the programs also kind of the transfer values are large in relative terms that correspond to 40 to 50% of the counterfactual household consumption. And the beneficiaries are Syrian refugees in Lebanon who are under temporary protection of UNHCR. They have similarities and differences with respect to the native poor population, which I go into details in a second. But the most important ones are they lack assets. They usually leave their assets in the home country. They're mostly excluded from the institutions in Lebanon. They're recent migrants and they have exposure to conflict, which might reduce the possibility of having sustained effects on in these programs. So our contribution is for a wide range of economic well-being outcomes. We show evidence that UCTs are highly effective in improving economic well-being, and these findings are in line with the existing literature. But we do show that the effects almost completely vanish within months after the program cycle ends. We show that the reason for this is not myopic behavior or transfer values. These programs are very large. The term structure also doesn't seem to play a role. We find similar fallbacks to the initial consumption level for households who receive assistance for 1 year versus 2 years and so on. And we do think that the economic volatility is one of the reasons that the programs do not have lasting effects, and the limited capacity of households to basically save. The analysis that I'm going to present in a second is an observational study, but we fully specified the regression samples, the specifications, the variable definitions, the falsification test, and even the multi-hypothesis corrections. We have specified everything and followed it almost religiously. So let me just give you a little bit of background information. So we're in Lebanon. There are more than 1.5 million refugees, mostly Syrian. The inflow started since 2011. In general, the households are large, equal in gender, young, and relatively lowly educated. The refugee population is poor, but not ultra poor. So we're talking about around the median of $2 per day per person consumption. There are no camps in Lebanon. The refugees are integrated in urban and rural areas, and they do not live in camps, despite the fact that there are informal settlements in places like Bekaa, for example. Cash-based programs are managed by sister UN institutions that provide more than $350 million annually. They reach to the half of the population. We're looking at 2 programs. One is the multi-purpose cash that provides $175 per month, and this will go to the poorest, the most vulnerable, 60,000, roughly speaking, every year, 60,000 households. And then on the top of that, we have the food e-card program that goes to the 60,000 poorest households, but it goes above that and provides $27 per person per month to the 120,000 households, roughly speaking, per year. So which means that there will be 60,000 households that are eligible for both programs. And the programs are targeted through a proxy means test approach. So there's a prediction model that uses a nationally representative expenditure data and predict a vulnerability or poverty score for each household. So they extrapolate the prediction to the full population and assign a poverty score for each household, a predicted poverty score for each household using the observed characteristics that are available in the administrative data. And then they implement the programs, implement the threshold-based assignments. So basically would have try to reach to the poorest 60,000 households, let's say, and then the next household wouldn't be eligible when the budget is exhausted. And a standard kind of RD approach is possible. It creates discontinuity in eligibility around those thresholds. The scores, as opposed to what Berg presented, is we do not find any evidence that the refugees manipulate the poverty scores, and because the scores are actually only available to a handful of staff at UNHCR central office, even the field office workers wouldn't have access to them, and the refugees do not know their scores, and they're kind of a combined and a prediction based score. So it's also hard to guess which part of the household characteristics influences the vulnerability score. Here is a hypothetical example that we show. You can see that the bottom 60,000 households here, let's say like a family of 5 would receive over $300, will be eligible for both programs. And then right around to 60,000, the next household will be only eligible for the food program. And when you reach up to the poorest, like 20,000 households, the eligibility will be kept there because of budget issues every year, roughly speaking. So that will be, in other words, we have 2 discontinuities that we're going to rely on here to estimate the impact, just comparing the households who are around these 2 thresholds and who are very, very similar in terms of characteristics and initial poverty status. So we use both administrative and survey data. Our main outcomes rely on WASIR, which is a national representative expenditure survey that also assesses the vulnerability of the refugee population, is representative of the refugee population. There are around 4,500 households per year. We have 4 years of data from 2016 to 2019. And we merge this data with the existing administrative records on the vulnerability scores. And the one nice thing about this data is that whenever we observe a household in a survey, we have the outcome for that household. We can go back in years and actually find their poverty score and their assistance status in all the previous years that they were in the country. And not only we have the poverty scores that were assigned, we also know the actual assistance if the families receive assistance or not through UNHCR's assistance tracking system. We look at a wide range of outcomes. We look at expenditure, the first stage set of outcomes that are expenditure and consumption. We look at overall and subcategory. We look at child well-being outcomes, the likelihood of being out of school, child labor, and child marriage. We have health outcomes. We have food insecurity and food. These are just like food coping strategies, things like borrowing food or sleeping without food. And we create an index based on these coping strategies, which are quite common in the refugee population. And we also have livelihood coping strategies, which is basically living in very low quality household structure or house structure or accepting exploitative work and so on, and an index created based on these livelihood coping strategies. And to explain our results, we look at asset holdings and cash savings as well. We have 2 time points that we estimate these effects. One is the during program effect. So this will be, we observe households while they are receiving assistance and they're right in the middle of the assistance cycle. So the eligible households will be receiving assistance when we first observe them, and then we also observe them after program, and this falls into because of the way that the data is collected, the outcomes are observed like 18 months after the programs begin, which means that because the programs are 1 year, this is exactly 6 months after the end of the program. So the households received assistance for 12 months, but when we observe them, they are actually not receiving assistance from the focal cycle. So which gives us a nice kind of different 2 timeframes that we can look at the economic well-being. I'm not going to go into details in the. I think Miko has done an excellent job in explaining what regression discontinuity is. But we're going to restrict the sample to the 2 thresholds that we observe households in either side, and we're going to fit local linear functions, and we're going to estimate the jump and the change and the drastic change in we're trying to find drastic changes in our outcomes around that focal points. And I'm also not going to go over the design validation graphs here. We have a large battery of tests in the paper. For those who are interested, we look at density tests for manipulation of the scores. We look at falsification tests, not only on covariates, but also previous year's outcomes to make sure that households are comparable around these 2 thresholds. And also we'll look at whether the actual assistance have an impact on the score for the next round. And all these tests tell us that the design, the research design is in this setting is valid. So let me just show you the first stage. So these graphs will look similar throughout the presentation. So maybe I spent just a little bit of time on this. On the x-axis, what you're seeing is the distance to the eligibility threshold for two programs. Here at the multi-purpose cash, and here you have the food e-card program. The first panel shows that the current assistance status has nothing to do with the assigned score in that specific year, but if you look at the impact of the current year's poverty score on the next year's eligibility, you see a large jump here, almost religiously applied around the threshold. And this is due to the fact that, households who are just a little bit above the threshold in terms of poverty become eligible, while those who are just a little bit below are not eligible. And this holds for, these are during program effects, the middle panel. You can see that that on average, families who were eligible receive additional $30 per person per month, compared to what we call the control group. And then these cumulative transfers also hold 6 months after the program ends, when we observe the households 18 months after the beginning of the program. And then we'll look at expenditure. So here again, we have the multi-purpose cash on the upper panel and the food in the lower panel, and then left-hand side is the during program effects, and the right-hand side is the after program effects. So on the left-hand side, what you look at is that it just shows you that it's downward sloping trend, which shows that the prediction is doing a good job of predicting expenditure. The families who are poorer have higher poverty scores, so they're approaching to being eligible, and you see a large jump here. And this is in the range of 20 to 30% increase in consumption, a substantial increase in consumption, and this is because of the multi-purpose cash program. We estimate actually 7 to 8% increase in consumption through food, but this is really not powered enough. But if you look at this specifically, which is the food program is designed for the food consumption, there is a similarly substantial increase in food consumption. You can see those results in the paper. So during the program effects, there are two things: that the families who are beneficiaries, they increase their consumption substantially, and they also increase their food consumption, those who are eligible for the food programs. Whereas in the 6 months after the program, these effects completely vanish. And actually, you can see it, almost a negative effect here. That's quite imprecise. But the households who are eligible, who were eligible, and who received assistance for 12 months are equally likely or have the same consumption levels as households who have never received assistance up that point. And we're going to see the similar graphs for each of the outcomes that we look at. We look at separately child school enrollment. The multi-purpose cash program increases school enrollment and also decreases child labor. But then once the program ends after 6 months, we go back to the initial level. The foodie program do not have any impact on child well-being, both during and after the program. When we observe the households, we do not find across board for short-term or longer-term for health and healthcare access, because we think health is capital and hard to change. That's one reason, and the other reason is there are also a lot of other programs and support in place by UNHCR and WFP in terms of health and healthcare access. So we're not surprised that we find no impact on health, both in the short run and the long run. You can see the food program has, these are in the range of 0.3 standard deviation effects, quite substantial effect in improving food insecurity in the short run. But in the long run, again, the impact of food program also dissipates, and multi-purpose cash program has no impact on food insecurity, or this impact is more muted compared to the food e-card program. Livelihood coping strategies, again,
Around 20 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm right on time. Thank you so much. And when we look at the livelihood coping strategies, again, we see on the range of 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviation, which is, we consider sizable effects, improvement in livelihood coping strategies in the short run, both by the multi-purpose cash and the food e-card program, but longer term effects, again, we find the beneficiary families to be very similar to families who have never received assistance and versus families who received assistance for 12 months. And when we look at them 6 months after the program ends. And across board, this pattern keeps emerging. Unfortunately, we have limited measures of savings and assets in the surveys. So please bear with me when I try to explain these results. What do people do actually with the money, what they purchase, and if do they do anything productive with the assistance that they receive is an important question. We sort of answered that question, but not fully in this paper. So what we show is that if you look at the beneficiaries of multi-purpose cash assistance, you see that households actually try to save and they had higher savings. And this is around like 7 percentage points compared to a control of like 31% increase in savings. But they also are substantially more likely to spend savings to cope with income shocks that they receive. And the foodie program doesn't have this feature, but the multi-purpose cash program actually helps people to save, but they're also kind of like more likely to spend these savings soon after the program ends. And then when you observe them 6 months later, you can see that beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries are equally likely to have savings or have any money to spend to cope, to satisfy their basic needs. And again, the food program has null effects in the longer run as well. We also look at sort of like the more non-traditional forms of saving in terms of durable goods. There's so many of them, so we don't really kind of rely on like exact statistical power here, but you can kind of like eyeball the patterns that you can see that the red lines are kind of on the right and the green lines are kind of on the left, and this pattern also holds for the food program, which means that the families also save in terms of like buying washing machine, mattresses, durable goods, and oven and motorcycle and things like that while they are receiving assistance, but they're also substantially more likely to sell them actually after the program ends to satisfy their basic needs. Again, they liquidate. It looks like they save, but the savings are liquidated soon after the end of the program. Here we look at the term structure. We're comparing families who were never eligible for the program and who became eligible for the first time. And these effect sizes are very similar to families who received assistance for 2 years versus 1 year. So in other words, the term structure doesn't seem to matter in terms of like short run and the long run effects. You see very, very similar patterns when you split the sample by continuing beneficiaries versus those who are newly included. So term structure doesn't explain that. We look at temptation goods, it's all across board. This is validated by other studies too. There's no increase in consumption of temptation goods such as alcohol and tobacco. Refugees used the transfers to take children out of work. They go back to school. They try to save and purchase durable goods. So those are kind of like, or they also spend money to satisfy their basic needs. The transfer amounts are quite large, as I showed. So it's not a candidate to also explain the null effects in the longer run. So what we think happening is that because the refugees are receiving much more frequent shocks, income shocks and labor market shocks and mobility shocks, for example, compared to the native poor population, the duration of the impact of these programs are quite limited actually because of these reasons, despite the fact that we don't have the kind of like the hardcore evidence on that data limitation. We do think that this is likely to explain our results. So let me just very quickly summarize. So we look at the two large at scale implemented programs implemented by sister UN institutions, and we show that the assistance programs they provide, they're very good at providing temporary relief, but there's reversion to counterfactual well-being within months, and we try to explain that. And this kind of a little bit goes opposed to what the existing literature shows when these programs are implemented in the native poor population. And I stop here and thank you so much for listening to me. And I take any questions that are lingering on the chat or anyone who wants to ask questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Onur, for such a wonderful presentation. So we are following the chat to see whether there are any questions. I don't see anything here. So to everyone, in case of any questions, please post them here. And Agnes, if you could check the YouTube platform in case there are any questions in the platform, please.
Thank you.
So I don't see any questions here yet, except for a clarification from Bart and.
I apologize for the confusion. I didn't mean to say manipulation. And I was talking about manipulation in our setting. That in other words, like we don't see families reorganize their observable characteristics to become eligible. That's what I was trying to say.
Thanks for clarification. So let's give it 30 more seconds. In case there are no questions, we'll move to the fourth presentation.
I see one question there. Have you noted any difference in the long-term impact between beneficiaries or refugees waiting to be resettled and refugees that are not eligible for resettlement? My impression is that we don't have the numbers, but the resettlement figures are quite low in terms of numbers, and it's very hard, even though we don't have the data. But even though we have the data in our setting, it will be very difficult to identify separate effects for the refugees based on their resettlement status.
Okay, so I don't see any other question. Do you, Onur, do you see any other questions?
I don't think I see any, but thank you so much, and you can reach out to me through email. And we also have the paper on the webpage, and we welcome any comments that you might have in the future. Thank you so much.
So there's a question from Thomas. Maybe you could address that.
Oh, okay.
Since we have 2 more minutes.
So I think there is. I mean, we don't have. We looked at this data. We did not write a paper out of it, but we don't see any impact on out migration. The reason that we didn't try to put it as an outcome is because the sample is very limited, and the out migration, like the return, is so limited that it's just the levels are so low that identifying an effect will be by default will be impossible. So, but I don't think, and I do believe that there's another study from Lebanon that shows even the intention to migrate does not change based on receiving assistance, because refugees are aware of the fact that these assistance structures are 1 year and they're temporary, and they do not help them to settle in the host country. So they're very aware of that fact, I think.
Perfect. Let's end here. Thank you very much.
Of social
very quickly.
Suggestion. No, we do not have the outcomes, unfortunately. We do not observe the outcomes based on social cohesion.
So Onur, thank you. So we need to move on to the last presentation. Thank you very much for taking the time to present the results. And we will share authors' contact information in case you have further questions. You can reach out to the authors. Thank you. So on this note, let me move on to the last presentation, last paper, which is Keeping Refugee Children in School and Out of Work, Evidence from the World's Largest Humanitarian Cash Transfer Program. This paper investigates whether unconditional cash transfers can keep refugee children in school and out of work. The paper is authored by Aysun Aygun, Murat Kirdar, Murat Koyonsu, and Quentin Stoffler. On behalf of the team, Murat Kirdar will present the paper. Murat, over to you, please.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. This is joint work with Aysun Aygun from Istanbul Technical University, Murat Koyuncu from Boğaziçi, and Quentin Stoffler, who was at Istanbul Technical. Now he's at Mohammed V at Morocco. So in this paper, we are looking at the effect of the SSN program in Turkey on refugee children's school and work outcomes. As reported, there are almost 80 million forcibly displaced individuals globally, and about 40% of these people are children. And Turkey hosts the largest refugee population in the world, including 3.7 million Syrians, and about half of these refugees are children, and most of them do not live in camps. Like according to the recent numbers, less than 2% live in camps. And we are focusing on the effect of cash transfers on children's outcomes, their work and schooling outcomes. And in terms of schooling, refugees in Turkey have easy and free access to public schooling or any kind of schooling. Before 2014, there were special schools targeting refugee children, and since 2014, they are allowed to enter into the public schooling system. But still, their enrollment rates are not that great. In the 2017-18 schooling year, their 5 to 17-year-old children's enrollment rate was about 60%. And child labor is another problem in this context. In a recent work, we find that about 48% of 15 to 17-year-old boys are employed. And there have been several studies looking at the effect of cash transfers on children's outcomes, but why should we expect a difference in the effects for refugee children? Obviously, forced displacement causes a major disruption in the lives of refugee children. First of all, their families incur material losses and they are more likely to live in poverty. The children go over psychological trauma and they have difficulties in adapting to the new education system and potentially facing a language barrier. And as I told you, they are more likely to drop out of school and take up employment at young ages. Actually, schooling could have higher returns for refugee children because they learn a new language, they learn the customs of a new country. So it's really an empirical question whether these kind of cash transfers would affect refugee children differently from native children. And yet we know quite little about the effects of UCTs on refugee children, especially those living outside of camps like that in Turkey. The cash transfer, actually, Berk Özdağ gave you a lot of information about it already, so I'm going to move fast on these things. It's been implemented since the end of 2016, and 1.8 million refugees were taking it by February 2021. And the transfers are modest to generous. for a family of, for an average family with 6 members, we calculate that the total cash transfer is equal to 55% of the average monthly labor earnings of Syrian men in Turkey and 36% of their average monthly consumption. And this paper, along with the 2 papers that you have listened to, is some of the first evidence of the impact of a large-scale cash transfer program on the education and employment of refugee children. And we investigate the mechanisms underlying our findings in this paper. The data set that we use is the comprehensive vulnerability monitoring exercise conducted by the World Food Programme, and it's representative of the refugee population in Turkey. And we basically use the dependency ratio criteria within a regression discontinuity design. As Azad told you, if the dependency ratio is about 1.5 parents, the households are eligible for this benefit, and we use this. And we show that just passing this cutoff makes a very high jump in the probability of receiving the transfers. And we use a fuzzy RDD design to calculate the effect of cash transfers. A preview of the findings, we find very strong effects of the cash transfers in terms of reducing child labor and increasing enrollment of children. And the effect is most vulnerable, pronounced among the vulnerable groups. The quantitative effects are quite large. And we find that in terms of the mechanisms, we find that these cash transfers become a significant part of household income. They reduce extreme poverty and lower the chances that households engage in costly coping strategies. One nice thing about this data set is we can disentangle the effects of opportunity cost versus direct cost of schooling in children's school attendance. We find, because from the questions elicited, we find that the transfers have really been effective in reducing the opportunity cost of schooling. Households become more likely to send their children because this addresses the opportunity cost. We also find suggestive evidence that it increases schooling because it addresses the direct cost of schooling. We find that the effect is stronger for older children than younger children, which is consistent with the opportunity cost argument. And we find the effect is most pronounced among poorest households and larger households. A growing literature studies the effects of cash transfers, but few focus on children's schooling and work outcomes for refugee children. Actually, 3 recent papers look at large-scale cash transfers as we do. The previous studies generally look at small-scale effects. 2 are actually the papers that you have just listened to. And one is a paper by Musa and others recently published in the JD. And that paper also focuses on refugee children in the context of Lebanon. Unlike that study, we can go deeper in terms of the explorations of the mechanisms at play and impact heterogeneity because of our data set. The relevant paper that you just listened is the paper by Azad. But compared to that paper, we use a different data set, use different identification methods, and examine different outcomes. We look at children's employment as well as school enrollment. And our findings in terms of school enrollment are a bit different. While they find mixed effects, no effect at the mean, but higher enrollment effects for most vulnerable children, we find a strong effect at the mean. The policy, Özlem already told you about the policy. So basically there are 6 criteria, and we are using the criteria that matters the most, the dependency ratio criteria. And I already told you that the transfers are generous. Another important thing is that this program does not operate in a vacuum for children's outcomes. There is another big EU implemented project called PICTES, and this PICTES provides language training, backup training, catch-up training, and teacher and staff training for refugee children. So this policy is also important in the sense that it changes the bite of the SSN program. This policy is also the CC conditional cash transfer policy is available to all households and conditional on their children sending to school. It doesn't make a difference on either side of the dependency ratio cutoff that we use, but obviously it increases the bite of the program. It improves the schooling infrastructure, and it basically allows the cash transfers that ESSM provide us to matter. The data is the data collected by the World Food Program. We use the round 3 and round 4 because these are nationally representative. We have a sample of about 2,681 households. It includes Syrian as well as other nationalities, and we have detailed information on schooling. The strategy is RDD. We exploit the 1.5 cutoff. A peculiar feature of our setting is that the running variable is discrete. So the dependency ratio criteria is obviously discrete. So we use the Lee and Card show the conditions for inference in an RDD with a discrete running variable, and we follow that. Essentially, our identification is parametric because of this discrete running variable and the relatively few number of clusters on each side of the dependency ratio cutoff. We need to go ahead with parametric methods. Actually, we show the robustness of our results using non-parametric methods, but they are more volatile given our structure. And we use another recent paper which provide guidance on the selection of polynomial orders. So you might worry about the dependency ratio criteria because you might think that we are just comparing households with 2 parents and 3 children with 2 parents and 2 children because of the 1.5 cutoff. But the good thing for our context is that the household size of Syrians are really large. You see here the number of prime adults and the number of dependents. The bold ones are the ones where the dependency ratio cutoff is above 1.5, and you see a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the number of prime adults and number of dependents. So we're not really comparing 2 parent households with 3 children and 2 children. We're comparing many types of different households. And we Onur told you about the standard checks of RDD. There are 3 standard checks. The density score needs to be continuous around the cutoff. There should be no jump in the other pretreatment covariates. And when you take artificial cutoff values away from the actual cutoff, there should be no treatment effects. We check and show that these identification conditions hold. So this is basically our identification idea. Here you see the 1.5 dependency ratio cutoff, and you see that at the cutoff there is a strong jump in the fraction of people receiving the transfers. Here in the second one we zoom in around the cutoff more. Here it's the same graph, but we control for the other eligibility criteria, and even when we control for the other eligibility criteria, you see a jump. So in terms of estimation, we use a fuzzy RDD. And in the parametric approach, we start with the full data and we gradually zoom in around the cutoff to assess the robustness of our bandwidth. And we use different polynomial orders for robustness. We use different definitions of the outcome variables like number, share, and dummy variables. And we use a rich set of control variables. Here you see the results in terms of the share of children working and the share of children not going to school. Basically, you see a strong drop in the share of children working and the share of children not going to school. And our results, these are the reduced form results. You see a reduction once you pass the dependency ratio cutoff. You see a reduction in the share of children working and the share of children not going to school. These are the 2-stage two SLS results, which are easier to interpret. Here, we're basically looking at the effect of actually receiving the cash transfers. So here we start with the full data, and in different rows, we gradually zoom in around the cutoff. Basically, the last one is the closest one to the cutoff. But again, as I told you, because of the discrete structure, we cannot zoom in too much around the cutoff because of decreasing number of clusters. But in this bandwidth range, our results are quite robust. We find that cash transfers reduce the fraction children not in school by 20 to 25%, and children not going, children employed by 10 to 15%. So actually, these effects are quite substantial. The fraction of boys not in school falls by 64%, and girls by 59%. In terms of school, sorry. In terms of work, the effects are even larger. Then we look at the mechanisms. So first we look at whether this becomes a main income source, and it does. We look at poverty indices, and in terms of poverty, especially for extreme poverty, we see a drop. The estimation results confirm this. You see that the cash transfers become the main or secondary source of income. And even though we do not find an effect on regular poverty index, we find a strong effect on extreme poverty. So it really helps with the poorest households. Next, we look at food consumption and other consumption and coping strategies. You see a jump in food consumption in the graphs and a fall in coping strategies. If we look at the estimates, the results show a jump in consumption, but not statistically significant. But if you look at the magnitudes, actually, these are not small. They imply about a 20% increase in food consumption, but not statistically significant. But the results in terms of coping strategies are statistically significant. And the other one, the interesting one, is the reasons for children not attending school. And basically, parents who report that children do not go to school because they need to work false. And it also falls for the case children not going to school because they need to stay home and assist family. Also, they don't go to school because they cannot afford to pay school expenses. And we find that the policy really decreases the incidence of the first two. Basically, it really addresses the opportunity cost of schooling. It really decreases the marginal utility households gain from sending from their children's earnings. In terms of affecting the direct cost, we find only suggestive evidence. Then we look at heterogeneity. We find a larger impact on older children, which is really consistent with the opportunity cost argument. I told you that about almost 50% of 15 to 17-year-old boys work. So it really works with that. It is more effective on less educated household heads and poorer household heads. It is more effective on parents who have been in Turkey for a longer time. It's more effective on Syrians. And not here, but we recently checked by household size. The effects on schooling is more effective for larger households, but no such heterogeneity for employment. We do several robustness checks. We use alternative specifications in terms of control variables. We do alternative ways of calculating standard errors, including wild cluster, bootstrap, and multiple hypothesis testing. And we put restrictions on household structure. We use a Donato RDD to rule out manipulation around the cutoff. And we use local polynomial approaches. And all of these show our findings are robust. In terms of further analysis, we also use other methods. We use a propensity score matching and with the same data set, and we use that the results are robust. And we also use the data set that Özdar and co-authors used. And we use that data set and our methodology and show that our results on schooling and child labor are robust. So to conclude, This study shows that this multi-year program that provides modest and regular cash transfers produces a tremendous increase, positive effects on children's schooling attainment, and a tremendous decline in their employment because basically households overcome their financial constraints. And these effects are the strongest for the most vulnerable children, which is consistent with the best one luxury axiom. And we show that just providing cash alone without conditions generate these large positive impacts on child labor and schooling outcomes. In terms of generalizability, actually, many of the conditions that refugees face in Turkey are similar in many other low and middle income countries, particularly to the context of Venezuelan immigrants in Latin American countries or Syrian immigrants in Lebanon and Jordan, that they are poorer and they are more likely to work in the informal sector, like 98% in Turkey work in the informal sector. They have restrictions on formal employment. So in those senses, the conditions are similar. But there are some peculiar things about the Turkish context. First of all, the existing schooling structure absorbed refugee children has been really good. Children have free access to schooling and they can go to public schools. And more importantly, maybe there were complementary policies, which I told you before, the PIC test policy, which really improved the schooling infrastructure, particularly for the refugee children. So basically, it allowed the ESSI program to work better. So basically, we think that our findings can be generalizable to contexts where school and administrative capacities are similarly high enough to absorb and educate refugee children living outside camps. Thank you for listening, and I would like to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Murad, for such a wonderful presentation. So to the audience, so any question you have, you can either post it in the chat platform, or you can raise your hands. We can manually unmute you to so that you can speak out and present your question. Over to the audience, please. Any question? And also to Agnes, in case of any questions in the YouTube platform, if you could quickly check and let us know. So I don't see any questions yet. Is there any hands? Let's give it probably 30, 40 seconds. I guess your presentation was very, very clear. So that's why there is no questions, which is in a way a good sign. But at the same time, audience will have your contact information so that in case they have any questions.
We're willing to receive any questions via email.
Yes. So Alma requested to know about the frequency of the cash transfer. Do you have any information on that?
Oh, they are monthly levels. Yeah.
Okay. 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 Any other questions, please? Please feel free to raise your hand. We will get you and go from there. Okay, so I guess we can move on. In case of any questions, audience will have your contact information, so they'll reach out to you. Thank you again so much, Mark, for such a wonderful presentation. And on this note, let me close this session and also mention that our session, we can take a 15 minutes break before we start the next session, and we are looking forward to see you all in that session.